The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 saw the culmination of the Napoleonic Wars, decades of fighting between Britain, France and their continental allies, including Prussia, Austria, Poland, so on and so forth. And in that battle, a number of very famous and iconic swords were used, including this famous 1796 heavy cavalry pallasch. Now, the pallasch is a cut and thrust sword, in this case hatchet tipped. But what was it coming up against? Well, we already know that it was being used alongside perhaps the even more famous 1796 light cavalry sabre and various other curved swords by the light cavalry. But when we go over to look at the French army, they were using the famous cuirassier's sword. Now, the cuirassiers wore breastplates and helmets and used these very iconic straight thrusting palashes, completely different design to the British one. So which one was better and which one performed more effectively at the Battle of Waterloo? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, before I go into this, I just want to mention very briefly, this is actually the 1853 model cuirassier's sword. So this is actually a later model, but it's extremely similar in functional purposes, and I don't happen to have a Napoleonic period one at the moment in my stock, so I've grabbed this. But basically it has a very, very similar type of blade and a very, very similar hilt. Slightly different design, but functionally almost the same sword. The only slight difference we should mention is that some of the earlier Napoleonic cuirassier swords actually have a little hatchet tip, which is important. We'll come to that in a second, whereas these have spear tips, which were regarded as more effective for penetration. So we're looking at the French heavy cavalry sword used by the armoured cuirassiers, and at this time the British heavy cavalry sword, modelled on an earlier Austrian sword, the 1769, whereas this is the British 1796 heavy cavalry sword. And it should also be mentioned that the British heavy cavalry were not using breastplates at this point, although they did usually have helmets of various kinds. So the French heavy cavalry are cuirassiers, that is, they wear a cuirass and they are heavily armoured, and they're using a slightly different type of sword. So first of all, how do these two swords compare in their physical characteristics? Well, the first thing to say is, despite their look, and you might look at the French sword and see it's narrower and assume that it's therefore lighter, in reality, the French sword is both bigger and heavier. The French sword weighs over 1,300 grams and has a blade of up to 39 inches, very often about 38 inches. In fact, this one's 39, but as mentioned, this is a slightly later model. And the British sword has a 35-inch cut and thrust blade. We'll talk about the difference in the blade designs in a second. So 35-inch blade, so it's got a shorter reach, but only weighs just over 1,200 grams. So the British sword, despite looking perhaps heavier on screen because it's broader, is actually lighter than the French sword, and the French sword is heavier and longer than the British one. Now, length is an important feature, I'm afraid to tell you, but before we get into that, a quick word about the sponsors for this video. So if you love history, engineering, invention and art, and I guess if you're watching my channel you probably do, then you're probably going to get a lot out of the ultimate guide to rebuilding civilization. Whether this is for you or for one of your loved ones, this is an absolutely amazing thing to have. And it's not just the content teaching you how things work, how things in the world all around you that you take for granted work, but it's also the way and the care with which this is made. Over 400 pages. And if civilization collapses, let's hope it doesn't, but if it does, then indeed you're going to need to know all sorts of things about how to rebuild it, including all of the typical engineering sorts of things, but there's even stuff to do with art. And look, here you can learn how perfume is made. It's even got biology in there. Ever wondered how breathing really works? Well, now you can find out. With detailed text and explanations, beautiful illustrations, and a gorgeous quality of paper and binding. This would make an absolutely fantastic gift or just a really great collector's item. And needless to say, this wonderful work was put together by an amazing team of engineers, architects, scientists, artists, musicians. In fact, there were more than 50 professionals worldwide involved in putting together the contents of this amazing tome. With over 400 pages with the most amazing inventions of humankind, 180 topics divided into 23 chapters. When this project was launched on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, it attracted more than $3.2 million of support. So as well as an absolutely fantastic addition to your own library, this would make an awesome gift. And of course, it's not that long until Christmas now, or maybe someone's birthday is coming up. So you can check out my link down below, and you can use my special promo code Gladiatoria 10 as well. And hopefully you'll absolutely love the contents of this. And I can guarantee you that my kids are going to love this over the Christmas period. I hope you'll enjoy this as much as I have done so far. Right, so getting back to the main topic here. So we've established that the French cuirassier's sword is both longer and heavier. But as you've seen there, very easily, hopefully, the contrasting these two, they are very different blade designs. Quite simply, one is a primarily thrusting sword, while the other is, well, what is it? Well, let's put the French sword down for a second, because in a sense, the French sword's actually simpler to explain. What exactly is a pallasch? Well, pallasch actually comes around really as a derivation of the backsword and broadsword in the 17th century. By the 18th century, the general rule is that light cavalry, at least by the Napoleonic period, light cavalry tends to, not always, but tend to have sabres, while heavy cavalry tend to have a pallasch. Now actually, if we go back to the origins of these swords, we're really looking at Central and Eastern Europe. So Austria, Hungary, what's now Czech Republic, Poland, Lithuania, and so on. And in those countries, we find the hussars, and bear in mind at this time in Western Europe, we generally speaking have what are called light dragoons. They don't get renamed as hussars until later, largely due to fashion and copying Eastern European cavalry. But hussars tend to carry in Poland it would be the szabla or the sabre, the curved sabre, as their sidearm. But that isn't usually the only weapon they carry. Hussars also carry usually a firearm, and very occasionally also carry an armour-piercing sword, because of course armour was more common, certainly in the 17th century and even in the early 18th century. So they sometimes carry an armour-piercing sword that the Polish would call a koncierz. We might call it an estoc, for example, so a specialised thrusting sword, which might be a bit related to the French sword that we're going to look at in a second. So these were regarded as the sidearms, essentially adopted particularly after the spread of the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans and other parts of Europe, and also due to contact with North Africa and other regions. So these curved swords were adopted into Europe, although curved sabres had been around in Europe going all the way back to the days of Charlemagne. So they had existed, but they became more and more popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were used for light cavalry. Now, light cavalry predominantly were scouting, skirmishing, hit and run troops, and they weren't necessarily designed to go and get stuck in against heavy cavalry, which they would have a disadvantage against, or indeed against infantry. So these were hit and run swords designed to be used on the pass, and then you carry on through and get the hell out of there. In contrast, these are essentially basket hilted, although this isn't technically a basket hilt, it comes from swords that were basket hilted broadswords and backswords that were used by the heavy cavalry, which stem from essentially medieval knights, and then in the 17th century cuirassiers, and their job was to get stuck in. They were sometimes going to plough into infantry blocks, they were sometimes going to plough into enemy heavy infantry, so heavy cavalry, sorry, their similar equivalent, and so they were really the heaviest, they were on the biggest, strongest horses with the most powerful, heaviest swords, with the best hand protection, and often with armour as well, with the very at least helmets, and very often full cuirasses, and sometimes even full half harness. So these come from a different place, they come from a different philosophy. So by the time we get to the Napoleonic period, this is, although this is a 1796 pattern, this is modelled on the 1769. It's modelled on something that came earlier. So it's coming from an earlier tradition. So really, this is a broadsword. This is a cut and thrust sword. Now, if we just look at this point for a second, something very important happened during the Napoleonic Wars. This hatchet point, much like a katana or a falchion or a Chinese dao, is fantastic for cutting up here at the tip. It means that you still have a lot of cutting capacity all the way up, right the way to the very full extension of that 35-inch blade. However, these asymmetrical hatchet points kind of suck at thrusting. Obviously they can stab, just as any pointed piece of metal that you can find can stab, but obviously some pointy bits of metal are better at stabbing than others. And it was found that this type of hatchet point was not very effective at going through layers of clothing. If you were fighting particularly in winter time with a greatcoat over a woolen uniform and everything else, that would often fail to get through. Now, you can of course just cut, and we're going to talk about that point, how the soldiers actually used these in a second. But if we come over to the French sword really comes from a different tradition, and it comes more from the tradition of the consoeurs or the estoc. Okay, so what we have here is a double fullered blade. It's very thick in cross section and incredibly rigid due to the nature of those double grooves or fullers. The thing with those double grooves is they give it a particular cross section that, while it's very stiff and it's a good balance between weight versus stiffness, it kind of sucks at cutting. Moreover, you don't end up with much edge bevel. So despite the fact this is actually service sharpened, this one, despite the fact it does have a sharpened edge and you can obviously hit someone with it, and obviously it will hurt them and it will wound them, this will not pass through targets anywhere like as well as that will. And most people instinctively know that. When you look at a sword that's essentially like a dowel or a messer, you know that that's going to cut better than a sword that looks like this. Not only is it a question of weight distribution, it's also a question of edge geometry, the angle at the edge, and of course the cross section and friction as you pass through a target. So, whilst indeed with this whopping great 39-inch blade you can obviously hit someone really hard, it's never going to cut very well. And if someone's wearing layers of clothing and uniform, it's not really going to do very much. So this is primarily a thrusting weapon, and that's how the cuirassiers used them. So they relied on the protection of their breastplates and their helmets, they charged at full speed, and they used this like a lance to thrust through the opponent. Now, in the Napoleonic Wars, it was noted by army surgeons and lots of other people, even casual newspaper readers, that it was noted that people that got hit by cuts often ended up being incapacitated and wounded, but people who got hit by thrusts often ended up dead. Now, there is of course a paradox in military history. A wounded soldier can actually take up more resources as their wounds are healed and they're looked after in a hospital, and you have to transport them places and give them medicine and stuff like this. They can take up more resources for a nation than a dead enemy. A dead enemy, it's gone, you can't use them anymore, but they don't have to, sorry, not a dead enemy, a dead soldier doesn't have to be looked after anymore, they're gone. So the thrust versus cut debate was very complex and raged throughout the late 18th and into the 19th century. However, it was concluded that for heavy cavalry, everybody agreed these worked great for light cavalry, and the French light cavalry had a similar curved sabre model. But for heavy cavalry, it was concluded that the thrust was really, really effective. Moreover, because of the cuirassier's equipment. So, the cuirassiers, as we've mentioned, have helmets, cuirasses, lovely great straight swords like this that have got an incredibly long reach and can thrust very effectively. So you come up against these guys and you are, let's say, in the Scots Greys or the whatever dragoons, one of the heavy dragoon regiments or the Life Guards or something like this in the British Army, and you've got one of these to use against a cuirassier. Well, you hit them on the head. Oh no, they've got a helmet. You hit them across the chest. Oh no, they've got a breastplate. You can aim for the arms and legs and the face, and this was done and advised. In period text, they specifically say to aim at the face and aim at the arms of the cuirassier, because that's obviously where they're least armoured. However, looking across the organisational level of the British Army, they decided these points did not cut the mustard, or thrust the mustard. So they started adapting these. Now, I mentioned these in my dedicated video talking about 1796. They started putting spear tips, in other words, grinding that back edge to give a point, a tip, which was better for thrusting. And in that case now, you could thrust, which would give you slightly longer reach, at the cuirassier's face, for example, or groin or whatever, somewhere that wasn't armoured, and you could hit them with the point. There's a problem with that. The problem is, if you're coming against cuirassiers, you're now thrusting at them with your 35-inch blade, while they're thrusting at you with their 38-inch blade. you know who's going to hit first. So the cuirassier actually has the advantage still, because not only have they got armour, but they've got a longer blade. So I'm not so sure this was actually necessarily the best thing to do. Now, in terms of the sword designs, you could say that the cuirassier sword actually has better side of hand protection via the bars. As I say, this isn't exactly the same as the Napoleonic version. It's got little scroll rolls at the top of the bars, but it provides the same coverage and is basically a very similar design. And at the top, you'll notice the French sword essentially has a disc protecting the hand, but the disc protecting the British sword, based on the Austrian sword, is actually better, and it's steel rather than brass as well. So I would actually argue that actually used as a thrusting weapon, the British hilt, I would argue, is actually better than the French hilt. Ironically, as a cutting weapon, the French hilt is probably slightly better than the British. So, you know, you might have different preferences. There is an important other difference between the hilts, and that is the length of the grips. Okay, and you'll notice that the French grip is considerably longer than the British grip. That is an advantage. Why? Because for thrusting, you want to lay your thumb up the back of the hilt without having your thumb ram into the underneath of the guard. So this is designed to be a better hilt for thrusting, and even you'll notice has a slight angle on the grip, so it is better positioned to give point or to thrust with. So that's much better suited for it. The British sword, in contrast, is in line with the blade, so it doesn't have the cant and is a much shorter grip. And you can get the thumb up, but you have a lot less space to do it. This was designed primarily as a cutting hilt. As a broadsword or basket hilt, this works absolutely fantastic. But as a thrusting sword, the French sword is better. So finally, we're going to talk about how these things were actually used. Well, ironically, from the written sources, we know that the French troopers were literally told by Napoleon, he said, pointez, ne sabre pas. So he said, give point, don't sabre, or don't chop. Okay. Now, we know that they were supposed, I mean, just from the design of the sword, but also from Napoleon's own words, they were taught to thrust rather than cut. And we know that a lot of time they did. However, there are written accounts of cuirassiers actually cutting, which of course under pressure a lot of people do, because a lot of people's natural inclination when they're thinking, I'm gonna die, is to start swinging, okay? Because swinging is a more natural human action than doing this, okay? Far more ape-like. Now, ironically, this sword, if you're gonna go ape, and if you're gonna like give in to your natural human urges, this is actually a better sword for that. And if you actually get into the thick of a melee, chopping all around, this is gonna be a more effective sword. And in fact, we know, for example, Sergeant Ewart, who won a French eagle, captured a French eagle, did it by cutting, more or less. So we absolutely know that he laid about, and we've got other descriptive accounts as well of heavy cavalry troopers and officers using their swords to cut with. So, to conclude, the cuirassier sword is, I think, a more refined design and far better for thrusting. No question, it's a better thrusting weapon. It is longer, it's better balanced for thrusting, the hilt is better shaped for thrusting and for gripping it in the correct way. The point is better shaped and it's a more rigid blade. This is a better thrusting weapon because it was designed as a thrusting weapon from the ground up. And French cuirassiers wore helmets and armour and were told to thrust, even if they didn't always do so. This is a better cutting weapon. That should be obvious. If you give it a spear point, yes, it makes it better at thrusting than it would have been before. However, it's still nowhere near as good as the French cuirassier sword. But as a melee weapon, when you give in to your human urges, when you're in the thick of it and slashing and cutting all around yourself, this is actually the weapon I'd choose. So, to conclude, for giving point, if that's what you're gonna do, you want the best thrusting weapon possible and you're gonna wear armour, this is the best sword. So the cuirassiers had the best sword for them. However, for British heavy cavalry, who weren't fighting the cuirassiers on an even keel, they weren't wearing armour and they weren't just aiming to outreach the opponent with a longer sword because they don't have a longer sword. Ironically, this is actually the best sword for them because they're fighting in a different way. They're going to have to get past that point of the cuirassier. They're going to have to get in close and slash at the arms and the legs and the face and the bits that aren't armoured. And in close, once you've got in close, this is a better melee weapon than the French cuirassier's version of the pallasch. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have some great evidence which would refute everything I've said? I'd like to see it if so, because I've read a lot of the period sources and maybe we'll look at some of those period sources word for word in a future video. But for now, thanks for watching. As always, I have been Matt Easton and I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.